I intended to read this book, this like huge, thick, I think it was like 700, 800 page book. Maybe not the whole thing, but parts of it. A friend of mine in town gave it to me to read some parts of it so we could have some conversation with each other about it. It was my intention to read parts of that book, and I still haven't. It was my intention to bring that book, and I didn't. Is there anything that you have intended to do and just didn't get done? Is there a big home project like a bathroom or a kitchen that you're designed to work on yourself, that maybe you haven't started yet, or you started and you've left it? Maybe you intended to get all your all your Christmas shopping done and all your wrapping done by a certain time, and like me, you just haven't started yet at all. I've got one thing, but that's it. Is there something that you've intended to do, just haven't done it? Have you intended to maybe read your Bible a little more, or pray a little more? You just find yourself not getting around to it, or failing to complete it, or to do it faithfully. We have good intentions. Sometimes we do things with the best intentions, and either we don't do them right, or we don't do them at all. There's one profound truth, though, today that I want to talk about, and it's very simple. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. If you open up your bulletin, if you have a pencil, I want you to underline it. That's in verse 9. This is profound truth that says God is faithful. That's what I want us to talk about today. So if you have a pencil, underline that. God is faithful. Because you see, I'm not always faithful. And the people that Paul are writing to here, the Corinthians, they weren't very faithful either. They weren't faithful to each other, and they weren't faithful to God. There were a lot of different teachers that came to this town in Corinth to teach these people. And they aligned themselves with specific people. And they fought with each other concerning these different teachers that they had. They became unfaithful to each other and faithful to the proclamation of the gospel throughout Corinth, because they were so caught up in the factions that were being formed by these people. They were not faithful to each other. They also weren't faithful to God, because if you read Corinthians, you realize that many of them were caught up in pagan practices. Things that God had told them not to do, they were participating in. So they weren't only unfaithful to each other, they were unfaithful to God. There are limits to our faithfulness as human beings. We are never completely faithful. We can never be completely faithful. And I see that a lot in relationships. When somebody, a spouse or a friend, is unfaithful to you, whether something that may not hurt as much, like a lie, or may hurt a lot, like cheating. When a spouse is unfaithful, when a friend is unfaithful, we have a hard time being faithful back, right? It's hard for us to return that faithfulness when someone is unfaithful to us. Or we have a hard time being faithful because we have a hard time keeping our promises. And we might have the best intentions in the world to keep our promises. But things come up, and things happen, and we're unable to do the things that we promised. We have a hard time being faithful. I see this also a lot in positions of authority, positions of influence. And while positions of authority and influence speak into and they influence us a lot, oftentimes they're just as influenced from us as they influence us. And I see this in politicians a lot. Politicians aren't very faithful. Now, that's not really news to anybody, but if you listen to any political candidate, who offers up anything while they're running, most of the time they're not faithful to their promises. They're not faithful to the things they want to accomplish. Those things never really ever get done. And they change their mind because of peer pressure and societal pressure and worldly influence, and so do we. So do we. When we have positions of authority and positions of influence, we're not always faithful to our promises. We're not always faithful to the things that we desire to do and we've told people that we will do. When people are unfaithful to us, we are often become unfaithful. We're unfaithful, really, in keeping our promises because things just happen. Things come up. We get busy. We run out of money. We become unfaithful to keeping our promises, and we become influenced by a world, and we become influenced by the people around us, and, well, we don't accomplish the things that we've told people we would. Our faithfulness has limits. And there's a point for all of us when we will eventually throw in the towel. Whether somebody's unfaithful to us, and so we don't feel we have to be faithful back, we throw in the towel. Or we're sick of waiting for God. We're sick of waiting for His work and His plan for our life, and so we throw in the towel. When life gets hard, we throw in the towel on our faithfulness. When our peers pressure us to think a different way, we throw in the towel on our faithfulness. Faithfulness to God's word, faithfulness to His desire for our life. We as humans have a limit to our faithfulness. And whether you've experienced that or you understand your own limitation, we know it. Eventually, we will throw in the towel on each other. We will throw in the towel on ourselves, faithfulness to ourselves. And eventually we will throw in the towel of faithfulness in our relationship with God. And that is a fact. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we read a profound truth. That God is faithful. And while our faithfulness has its limitations, God's faithfulness does not. God's faithfulness has no limit. When the crowds on Palm Sunday traded in their hosannas for crucify hymns, Jesus remained faithful, not only to the plan of God, but also to the people that He cried out, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." When the disciples in the garden fled from Jesus as He was being arrested because they feared their life, Jesus stayed faithful to God's will and faithful to His plan that would ultimately save us. When you and I find ourselves being unfaithful to God in our thoughts, words, and our deeds, God remains faithful to us. God remains faithful to us by always forgiving the sins that we commit. He promised you that in your baptism, that you are now washed clean daily by that promise of God, that no matter when you find yourself being unfaithful, God will always be faithful, because it says here, God is faithful. God's faithfulness is not dependent on your ability to be faithful. God's faithfulness is not dependent on your ability to live up to a certain standard. God's faithfulness is only dependent upon Himself. When our faithfulness to God is swayed by the situations around us and the bad things that happen, God not only stays faithful to you, but He stays faithful to the things that He has said about Himself. And I think about the people of Israel, these people that He says, "These are my chosen people." And yet if you've read the Old Testament, you know that those people are pretty messed up, right? They constantly did the wrong thing. They constantly worshiped other gods. They constantly ran from God, and yet God continually brought them back into a relationship with Himself. Because God said, "These are my people." And He says the same thing to you. Because at the font He called you his own, he is faithful to that. And as we run and as we flee from him, as we commit sins against him and do things that he's not commanded us to do, he pursues us just like he pursued the people of Israel. Here in 1 Corinthians 1, if you were to look in your Bible, you'd see the title Thanksgiving right above this section. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 to 9. And as you read it, you really don't think that Paul's actually thankful for the people. But he is. He is thankful for the people. But he's ultimately most thankful for what the people have. And that is a faithful God. That despite their inability, these Corinthians, despite their inability to always be faithful to each other, to God, Paul knew that their unity, that what bound them as the Christian church in Corinth wasn't their ability to be faithful with each other. It was solely the faithfulness of God. Their unity was dependent on the faithfulness of God, not their faithfulness. It is God that held these people, these broken these broken people together. It was God's faithfulness and promise that held these people together, just as the Corinthian church was held together, so are we. Despite our brokenness, despite the tensions that may be here amongst us, God holds us in unity together, because in our baptism, we each were united with Jesus, both in his death and in his resurrection. And in our being united with Jesus, we're also united as members of his body, as members of his family. Our unity, whether just in this church or across the world, our unity as God's people finds its solid ground in the limitless faithfulness of God, especially in light of our inability to be faithful. We see it most clearly in light of our inability to be faithful. God is faithful to you. He is faithful to the church. He is faithful to the world, and he will always be. We get to rejoice in that this Advent season. This Advent season, we take time to rejoice in this messy intertwining of heaven and earth in the person of Jesus, which is one of the most powerful and beautiful expressions of God's faithfulness to us, God's faithfulness to you. Christmas and the birth of Jesus and his whole life that follows is God's most clear expression of his faithfulness to the world, to the church, and to you. As through Jesus, he restores that broken unfaithfulness that is so deep within us. Christmas is God dwelling with man once again, restoring what he lost in the garden, because he's faithful to the promise that he made with Eve, that he made with Adam. Jesus' birth was something that had been promised centuries before it happened. We talked about that on Wednesday night. From the time of, what do we read? Isaiah? From Isaiah to the birth of Jesus was some 600 years. And yet God remembered his promise. And he fulfilled it in the person of Jesus. Advent is a season that we once again learn to lean on the limitless faithfulness of God. Not only as we celebrate the promises that found their answer in the birth and the life of Jesus, but also and ultimately as we await for Jesus to return. So in this Advent season, in this season of waiting, as we light our Advent wreath, it is a representation, it is a symbol for us of our faithful God, where we find all hope, where we find all joy, where we find all peace, and where we find all love. God is faithful. In the name and for the sake of Jesus, who is faithful to you. Amen.